Hello, Daniel. How are you? Oh, let's see. Olivia's here. Emma. How's it going?
Hello.
Howdy.
Were you able to access the Google Doc?
Yes.
Very good, very good. What's up, Braxton?
What's up, Coach?
How's everything going with everybody? Have y'all been doing any of this with any of your other classes yet?
I had to do some homework for college algebra, but that's about it.
Okay. Very good. Hey, Miss Hunt, how are you?
Hi. Good. How are you doing?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. You're surviving?
I'm surviving.
Now we're going to have, and this is just kind of for everybody, we're going to have quite a few people on the call. So we're going to have Millwood students. Miss Hunt is the AP US History teacher at Millwood. Coach Hampton is an AP teacher at McAllister. He might be joining us here in a little bit. We have students from Millwood, McAllister, and then we have some students from Enid as well. I saw some of them jump on. We might have some from Ponca City as well. And again, we're just gonna review as best we can. I'm gonna keep you guys up to date with the AP exam. McAllister students, we're gonna continue to send you guys kind of what you need to do for like your classwork and stuff to make up grades and whatnot. We'll kind of do that off of this since we have everybody on the call. But I do hope everybody on the call knows if you have any questions, you guys see the Caldwells are joining us there. Good to see you guys. But if anybody has any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. You can also access, if you want to speak on here directly, of course, feel free to do that. If you're not talking, it's probably best to mute the call. Yeah, it just kind of helps a little bit of background noise, and I'm sometimes the worst offender at that. So if you're moving stuff around, I'll try not to do that. But feel free to email. Feel free to, if you don't want to talk on camera, you can also send me directly a chat here at the very bottom, and we all see those as they pop up. So if that's easier for you as well. I see Mr. Carnes is joining us. He's an AP US History teacher out of McAllister. And I do want you guys to know I am going to record this. And if you don't want to be recorded, don't want to be videoed, I understand. You can just shut down the video portion of this. If you hit stop video in the lower left part of the screen, nobody will see you. But just so students that missed this, I've already had a couple of students reach out to me and say, I can't make it during this time. So I told them, hey, no problem. Here's all I want you to do is I'll upload the video later, and that way you can get caught up that way. So that's really kind of the background here that I wanted to make sure that we were all aware of. So on all of the Zoom meetings, I'm going to share with you guys these discussion questions. And what I hope for you to do is beforehand, now I'm going to make it where you can't edit the actual document, right? So what you do is I'm sorry if this is like too elementary. I know y'all got this, but you can make a copy of it and you can mess with it all you want. But I wanted the original to stay intact. And then as we go, if we want to add things to it, I don't mind doing that as we go. But I wanted this to be the discussion that drives what we're talking about. So let me think if there's anything else before we kind of get into this. So you have that document there. Again, I want you to access it beforehand. I would really like for you guys to go ahead and type out some answers. Again, I'm not looking for complete sentences or anything like that. Bullet points are fine. One of the things that I want you to emphasize here is we're reviewing for this end of course exam. And as we're finishing up the curriculum is think about specific evidence to support these type of statements. Okay, when I say something about this first question is going to be, again, and it's a link on the bottom of the Zoom invite. You know, the first question is, what were the dynamics of the Cold War with the Soviet Union from the 1950s, and how did Eisenhower and Khrushchev combine confrontation and conversation in their relationship? And again, I give you guys some bullet point options under there of some ways where to take the conversation, things to address. but be sure when you talk about how the dynamics have changed or how they're the same, you give specific evidence to show that. Before we get into that answer, I want to see if anybody knows where I am. Okay, so I have this little background here going on. Does anybody know where this is? I'll move out of the way.
Potsdam.
Close. Close. Before Potsdam.
Yalta?
Yep, this is Yalta. So here we have Joseph Stalin, right? Here we have President Roosevelt. Kind of look like I'm picking his nose there. President Roosevelt. And there we have Winston Churchill, who everyone knows I'm pretty fond of there. So we got Soviet Union represented, United States, and Great Britain. I think this is a great place to start the conversation. Our topic today is going to be foreign policy. And foreign policy post-World War II. So one of the things I really wanted to emphasize is this shift at the end of World War II. This is a meeting, World War II is still going on. And what's decided at this meeting is what are we going to do post-World War II? Right? Does anybody know any of the things that they decide at this particular meeting? What was instrumental that they decided? Remember, the war's still going on. What did they decide they were going to do when the war was over here at this meeting?
Create the UN?
Yes, that's huge. Okay, they're going to create the United Nations. Thank you, Olivia. By creating the United Nations, what they're hoping is that they're going to bring all countries. There's going to be 190 countries. They're going to all be in this representative body. And so if there's a disagreement in the future, they can just talk it out, okay, rather than trying to maybe force a war again. They wanted to be able to talk out their problems, okay? But there's a big issue. Joseph Stalin wants 16 seats in the United Nations. Why does he want 16 seats? He's one country, the Soviet Union. Why does he want 16 seats?
Because maybe the Soviet Union, they took over several other countries at the end of World War II, and so each of them get a representative?
Exactly. So again, we're here towards the end of World War II. We have Great Britain, we have the Russians, and we have the Americans, right? War is almost over. Hitler's surrounded, still got to defeat Japan. And now we're seeing all of these powers say, well, what's going to happen next? And the Soviet Union's making a power play here. They're going to say, okay, well, if everybody gets a vote in this United Nations, we should get 16 votes. Hey, Raksha. Because we are taking over. We are actually a union of 16 countries. So we should get 16 votes, which of course Churchill's like, are you kidding me? Like, you control them. Like you took them over. You don't get to then act like they're different countries anymore. But he pushes for that, and we actually give him 2 extra votes. We give him a vote for the Ukraine, and we give him a vote for Belarus. And so we actually give him, like, the United Nations starts out with the Russians getting extra power. This is really significant because I'll give you a couple other things that happened. They decided to divide Germany up in this meeting. That when the war's over, Germany is going to have to do several things. They're going to have to demilitarize, they're going to have to denaziize, and they're going to have to be divided in these separate quadrants, right? But what's really important is if you look at those quadrants, the United States gets the bulk of the West, and Russia gets the East. We are now turning to a page, and again, Churchill talks a lot about this in his memoirs, that they're not a power player anymore. It's really not about Russia, Great Britain, France, Germany, it's really become about 2. It's become about the Russians and the Americans. And again, the French and the British, they can talk, and they can, and Churchill talked about that, to say, I'm here and I can talk, but like nobody cares anymore. It's clear these are the 2 most powerful countries in the world. And so that being said, that brings us into that first discussion question, which is these dynamics, right? Now that everyone sees that these are the 2 clearest superpowers, what happens next? So why is space so important? I kind of feel like a lot of times we skip over that part. So why does this begin to be such a space race? What's the big deal about space in this Cold War?
It's not even about space. It's just technological advancements. I mean, with nuclear arms and, rockets rockets and that kind of technology, I mean, that just kind of propels the world into a more advanced society and just global. It's just a global phenomenon, you know?
Yeah, you can compare the fight for space superiority to the fight for air superiority between the First and Second World Wars, because whoever controlled space controlled the entire world, basically, as far as tactical advantages go and surveillance, spying. Whoever controlled space controlled the world in that matter. So.
Yeah, I agree with that, because wasn't the Americans scared that if Russia could get Sputnik into space, they would be able to drop missiles from space onto the American soil?
Absolutely. All great answers right there. It was bigger than space in the fact of it was technological advancement, but it was also space was, you know, what if all of a sudden you could utilize satellite technology? What if, and there's a rumor going around that when they launched Sputnik, that what was going to happen was the Russians were going to put nuclear missiles and hide them behind the moon. Now, of course, today we're kind of like, well, hide them behind the moon, that's kind of impractical. That really doesn't matter. What's significant is this understanding of, if you get the space technology, you have satellite imagery. First of all, you can see what I'm doing in my backyard now. And they understood that in the 1950s, that listen, they can actually use satellites to see what's going on. They could use satellites to use missiles to guide them into our country. And they could literally hide weapons in space. So this is why the space race begins to be so important. And in 1956, when Sputnik is launched, they have a satellite in space and we don't. So these rumors about, well, what are they doing? Are they hiding things behind the moon, everything else? Like, those were very scary back then because you really didn't know what they were doing. Okay. 1950s also, this is your, if any of you are 007 fans, right? This is why, you know, that genre really gets going about spies, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out, what are they doing? What are their secrets? What do they have? And of course, they're doing the same thing with us. You guys read about the Red Scare there in World War II and post-World War II. That's absolutely part of this as well. And so, by the way, let's go ahead and make sure we mention this. Why do we call it the Cold War?
It's not like really a war of fight, like battleground fighting. It's more or less just threats of nuclear destruction.
There's tension
stuff that can wipe out
everything.
entire population.
Very good. Yeah, if you say the heat, if you've ever heard the expression "the heat of war," they mean like bullets firing, you know, and things like a lot of action going on, and that's not going to happen. But the threat is very real. Okay, so it's cold in the fact of, do we have a lot of battles where the Americans march against the Russians? No, really, we're going to see what Korea is like and what Vietnam is like, but they're still proxy wars. They're not us line up all of our troops and go against all their troops, because honestly, what happens if you do that in the 1950s?
You're going to get destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, you have nukes now. So if you really want to go toe-to-toe and go all out, this is the end of the world as we know it. I mean, and that sounds like a dramatic statement, but it's honestly not. I mean, there's even predictions back then that there's enough nuclear weapons to destroy half the world over immediately in the 1950s, much less radiation poisoning that goes on from that. Okay, so the potential to destroy each other is unmatched in world history in the 1950s. So it begins to be proxy wars. Okay, so we're not going to let you grow. Again, the United States thinks that you need to keep the Russians intact, and the Russians are going to try to continue to expand their territory. And that's really what the Cold War, if I had to boil it down very quickly, that's really what we're talking about. So tell me a little bit about Cuba. Where does Cuba fall into all of this Cold War, 1950s, 1960s confrontation?
Pre-Cold War, the United States had a pretty good relationship with Cuba, but after Castro took over, he was allowing Soviet troops to enter Cuba, and Cuba quickly became a puppet state of Russia, and so the U.S. kind of had to intervene in all that. So,
very good.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that this really accentuated the fear of communism overtaking the United States, considering that Cuba's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And Eisenhower has to implement $500 million in order to prevent this intervention and overthrow the Cuba communist regime that's starting to form.
Well said, Braxton. I'll go ahead.
And I got to ask as well, because you mentioned the that we had a pretty good relationship with Cuba prior to them going communist. Did we really have that good of a relationship? From the end or beginning of the century to the 1950s, look into that and what our relationship was really like. Were we really good friends with them, or were we more overlord in terms of do this or do that type of thing?
I would say we were more overlordish, considering that Fidel Castro, he really didn't like all of the American intervention happening throughout the world, and thought they were, I don't know, almost using their power for not the greater good.
Very, very good points. Yeah, the proximity is important, right? To know that they're that close, because at this point in time, we have very limited use of ICBMs, okay, intercontinental ballistic missiles, meaning that you can't shoot a missile from Russia to America in the 1950s. You can shoot a missile from Cuba to most of the United States. So that proximity, and especially when we start talking about when the Russians move nuclear weapons into Cuba, that's why Cuba begins to be so important. And that's a great point by Mr. Carnes, that, again, don't forget that the Cubans view us as being someone who's very much used them, who has oppressed them in ways, who's been, I like the phrasing of being an overlord to them. Absolutely. And so when they get a strong-armed leader, they're going to be a very willing actor to push back on America. And, of course, how best to push back with to America than to align yourself with our arch nemesis, who is the only country in the world that is our equal in power. It appears in the 1950s. So, and when we talk early 60s, what you're going to see is the nuclear weapons moving to Cuba as an agreement between Castro and the Russian government. And that's something that Kennedy is going to have to deal with. Even before then, one of the things that's interesting in all of this is towards the end, let's see, Emma messaged that, oh yes, they cut off imports from Cuba. Yep, very good. Yeah, you're going to see some of the unique ways in which Kennedy operates with the Cubans as well. Once they get the nuclear weapons, the quarantine that's going to go on there and whatnot is going to be very fascinating as well. Before we get into that, I wanted to mention Gary Powers. Towards the end of the Eisenhower presidency, he'd actually worked his way to have a pretty stable relationship with the Russians. He actually thought they'd gotten to a point where there could be some agreements on nuclear weapons and some other things. But a U-2 spy plane is shot down, and the Russians are then made aware that we've been spying on them the whole time. And that really caused a decay of relationships. And honestly, it's going to go all the way to the 1970s before you're going to see any type of closeness between us and the Russians again. So there's that kind of lost moment. Eisenhower talks about that later in life, that, you know, he kind of felt like things were really moving in a good direction till that point. That's a whole other story I would tell you guys to look further into. It's fascinating to see these U-2 spy planes. They could fly high enough above radar, but Gary Powers got a little low, and they saw him and shot him down, and they actually got him alive. So they got the full confession and everything from him. So it's a fascinating story. But let's go ahead and move on into the next discussion question we have here, which is moving forward. Again, Emma kind of pointed that out, that we're going to have the 1960s. We're going to have a Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, where nuclear weapons are brought into Cuba, and we quarantine Cuba, and we have a blockade and don't allow any ships in there, and we end up negotiating an agreement with the Russians to move the weapons out. And again, we can go into that in more detail kind of towards the end of this call if you want. But as then we begin to get in the 1960s with Kennedy as president, we begin to get involved in a place called Vietnam. Let's talk about where does this come from? Why does the United States begin to be involved in Vietnam?
The current leader of Vietnam ruled with like pro-American government, and the anti-ruler person threatened to topple the government from power. So JFK was kind of like, this is worrisome. And that's kind of going into the one doctrine. Was it the Truman Doctrine, where it's like, if there's a communist threat, then we're going to stop it.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that. So a few other things. And again, guys, I'm briefly going over the foreign policy post-World War II. because again, you're not going to be asked directly about this foreign policy, but you can use this as evidence in your answers. So that's why I'm trying to go over this so you get brought up through this and know kind of what happens post World War II. And at the end of the call, we're going to go back over kind of all foreign policy. But yeah, you have a long telegram from a George Kennan in the 1940s, which says, look, you got to contain the Russians. Like that's and guys, here you go. Has anybody seen Chernobyl? Put your hand up if you've seen the documentary. Oh, it's not a documentary, it's an HBO series, Chernobyl. Okay, Braxton has, I'm not seeing anybody else, kind of flipping through everybody. So I will say, I finished it last night. Probably not the best time to watch like a documentary like that. It's a little kind of dark, and I was kind of like, man, I kind of want to watch like The Office or something now. But so it's fascinating with the cover up of the Russians in this incident, this nuclear meltdown. I do recommend it. It was great. It was very well done. But it is interesting that you get that Russian mindset, which George Kennan says, look, if you go back in their history, and if you guys remember from world history, the Russians are always looking to expand. Why are they looking to expand?
Because they have that frozen tundra on the other side. They need more land.
Exactly. Yeah. Most of their continent is frozen solid for most of the year. Almost all of their ports freeze through part of the year. So they are always looking for more fertile soil, and they're looking for warm water ports. Okay. They want a place where ships can come in and bring them supplies year round. And so you can go back hundreds of years into their history, and they have really bad relationships with their neighbors. They're always looking to grow. And George Kennan writes this. He's a diplomat that was in Russia for decades. And he said, listen, you want to understand how to win the Cold War? Here's how you do it. You contain them. You don't let them spread. Okay. Everywhere they try to move, you cut them off. You don't let them grow. You contain them where they are. They're going to be very difficult to ever beat directly. Okay. But you can hold them where they are. And that begins the Truman Doctrine, and the United States government has that policy from that point on, which is contain them. And as we begin to see Vietnam, which again, there's a huge backstory here. The French controlled it. The Vietnamese throw out the French. And then their southern leader, or their northern leader, decides that he is going to be a communist state. And when they reunify, he wants the entire country to be communist. Of course, JFK doesn't want that to happen, because why? Well, because look, they're growing. And there was a theory out called the domino theory. The domino theory was, if a state in Southeast Asia falls and goes communist, the rest of Southeast Asia is going to go communist. And just think very briefly why losing Southeast Asia would be very important, why that would be so detrimental to our efforts.
Resources?
Resources, number one, absolutely. What else? You think Southeast Asia, it's one of the most populated areas in the world. I mean, we're talking an incredible amount of people that would now be under communist rule. And again, when you have the Chinese that are communist, you have the Russians that are communist. If you let them go down into Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, you're talking about losing hundreds of millions of people into this massive block. And so that's why you begin to see JFK utilize military advisors there. One of the problems JFK runs into very quickly is, okay, this actually is just a really good point to make about Cold War relations. The United States often gets put in this situation. You got a communist leader who's a terrible person, and then you have the leader of the free people that's a terrible leader too. That's a brutal dictator. And that's part of the problem here is the leader we support in South Vietnam is terrible. He's absolutely terrible. We see Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in the streets just to show how much they hate him. I mean, it's a terrible situation, but that's who we're supporting because we really don't have much of a choice. But as this continues, the United States, we're going to see more and more slowly get involved in Vietnam as things begin to escalate.
Coach Walters, did you mention Kennedy, the assassination of Diem, the South Vietnamese leader?
No, I didn't. If you want to share some, we're going to see, it's kind of the old theory, if you break it, you bought it, right? So we help assassinate this terrible leader of South Vietnam. And once we do, we have to then begin to support more of the effort of the new leader and try to help support them. And as that happens, we begin to be more and more involved. So again, that old theory, there's a great political cartoon back then. Anybody familiar with Brer Rabbit? I might have discussed it very briefly when we talked about the Old South. Brer Rabbit, it's this old cartoon. It's a really racist cartoon, honestly. Like if you look at it, you can tell the way they depicted black people in there, it's terrible. It was really popular in the South back in the early 1800s. But there's a famous cartoon where it's a bunny. Like the bunny is like the main character. And the bunny, these wolves, okay, I'm going to have to tell a little bit of the story, sorry. But these wolves are trying to catch and eat the bunny, right? So in one of the episodes, the wolves get a tar baby. Like it's a fake looking baby that's made out of just tar. And they sit it out. And the rabbit, Brer Rabbit, grabs it and it gets stuck to him. And so now he's got this like huge, fake baby that is sticking to him. It's sticking to the ground, it's sticking to trees, and they're trying to catch him, okay? So there's this great political cartoon that shows Vietnam as a tar baby and the United States getting trapped, stuck to it. And it's a great kind of description for the way a lot of people viewed Vietnam for us, which was that, once we got more involved, once we helped, allegedly help, seems pretty obvious now we did, but assassinate a leader, once we supported his overthrow, and once we moved in with the new leadership, that now it's kind of our problem. We're kind of stuck with it. And there's a